The First World War began when some archduke was shot in a corner of the world that most Europeans couldn't find on a map, and ended with millions dead and a generation traumatized. And today we're going to look at what it was about the First World War exactly that caused so much trauma. What caused it to be so bad? Why was it so violent? Why was it so long? And how might the experience of trench warfare affect states' willingness to fight another war in the future, even if that war looked like it was going to be necessary? What was it about this war that caused people to enlist with full patriotic good intention and then leave writing poetry like Wilfred Owen's Dulce et decorum est? If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children, ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. What was it about World War I that made a generation conclude that it is a lie to tell people that it is sweet and right to die for your country? That's what we're going to be looking at in today's lesson. First, let's check your notes from last time. You were asked to add detail to the description and causes of World War I, so make sure that this information is in your notes. First, the description. World War I was the first total war fought between the industrialized great powers of Europe and Russia, which was not industrialized, from 1914 to 1918, and their colonies, and eventually the United States. The Allies included mainly Britain, France, and Russia, and eventually expanded to include also the United States, Italy, and Japan, and others. The Central Powers included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy at first, although it switched sides before the end of the war. Also before the end of the war, Russia dropped out to sign a separate peace with Germany, and like I said, the US joined on the Allies' side. Another important description of World War I has to include the effect of new military technologies and the need to generate public support for the war led to a new type of warfare called total war, and specific to World War I, trench warfare. That's what we're going to be looking at today. It became the most deadly war in history at that time, more deadly than all of the wars of the previous centuries combined. In terms of causes, World War I was caused by multiple long-term factors like nationalism, alliances, militarism, and imperialism that came together with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, which we went into detail in the previous lesson. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand pulled Germany into the conflict through Germany's alliance with Austria-Hungary. And in an attempt to avoid a two-front war, Germany attacked France, which was allied with Russia, which was allied with Serbia, and then went through Belgium to attack France, which Britain had promised to protect. That's the shortest possible version of how the alliances roped everybody into World War. So pause the slide here and make sure that this detail is in your notes, then press play again. Here you can see the various alliances on the map. Notice that it was a world war and it involved colonies of all of these states and their dominions in the case of the British. And the thing about this war was, as historian Paul Fussell wrote, well, he's not a historian, he was an English professor, whatever, close enough. He wrote a wonderful book about the First World War. And the thing about it was the irony. He writes, every war is ironic because every war is worse than expected. Every war constitutes an irony of situation because its means are so melodramatically disproportionate to its presumed ends. In the Great War, 8 million people were destroyed because two persons, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his consort, had been shot. And it's kind of this disproportion of causes to effects that makes the First World War so haunting. It started basically over the tiniest conflict and escalated until millions and millions and millions were dead in the trenches within 4 years. I keep saying trenches, and the reason is that trench warfare is kind of the most iconic style of warfare for World War I. And it did more than anything else to kill this idea that war could be heroic or glorious. And it's this contrast that really affected people. Before World War I, people believed that the war would be fast, easy to win, that they could enlist, go be heroic, prove that they fought for their country, come home heroes. It would be glorious, and that would be the end of it. They thought it'd be done in a couple of months. Part of the reason people thought this, aside from nationalism, was that industrialized armies of Europe had gotten very used to using their weapons of war against opponents who didn't have similar weapons. They'd spent the past half century conquering or dominating the globe as the only side in the fight with machine guns. But when both sides have machine guns and they point them at each other, the results are pretty quickly horrific. In World War I, both sides had the same weapons. Both sides were relatively evenly matched, and that led to a stalemate or a tie, and a war of attrition, a war that you can't win by rushing at the other side and gaining ground. You have to win it by basically wearing out the other side's ability to wage war. As a result of this, new weapons and new tactics emerged in the moment to adapt, but strategy didn't adapt. And so the adaptation to this new style of war happened badly, and as a result, millions and millions and millions died. What you see on the screen on the right is an aerial view and a modern view of what's left of the trenches. And what would happen in trench warfare is, because both sides had machine guns, right? Over here, and they were pointed at each other, both sides also then had to dig into the ground for cover. So you ended up with this type of fighting where both sides dug into the ground and protected their side with barbed wire. Eventually, though, because the tactics didn't keep up with this new style of warfare, people still thought that they had to rush the other side to gain their trench, to capture land, like you used to in wars before. And so you'd have people pop up over the top of the trench and go run at the other side, which, again, is firing machine guns at them and is protected with barbed wire. And the result between the trenches was awful. Running at an opposing trench is basically suicide, and soldiers came to know this in short order. As a result of that, new weapons were developed to try to gain an advantage. So, aside from the machine gun, we had the first use of poison gas, mustard gas, and chlorine gas used in war. It was carried by the wind and would reach the other side's trenches, and then because it's heavy, it would kind of dip down into the trenches and burn out the other soldiers' lungs, and just kind of sit at the bottom, so it would kind of get everybody all at once, and it was horrific. In addition, you had brand new weapons that could expand the reach of the battlefield. You had submarines, which could attack underwater. This was new. Airplanes, which could drop bombs. Tanks, which turned out to not be very useful in World War I. Hand grenades and flamethrowers. And because it was a stalemate, because neither side could make a move to win, and there was no real decisive battle that you could win to kind of gain an advantage in the war, both sides ended up throwing tons of weapons, tons of money, and tons of troops, human bodies, to win. And millions would die without gaining any ground at all. So nothing was accomplished, and there was just more and more death. Soon enough, it became a war of attrition, meaning a war that you win by wearing down the enemy's capacity to sustain war, instead of winning with a decisive battle or by taking the capital city of the opponent, like you used to. Wars of attrition mean that one side needs to get more resources in terms of money to feed all of these troops, weapons for all of these troops, bullets, guns, Poison gas supplies, if you're going that route. Soldiers to keep feeding the trenches, to keep rushing the other side. One side needs more of that than the other. Or one side needs to knock out the other side's ability to produce weapons. So like you start to think about, well, maybe if I bomb the factory where they make all of their weapons, I'll gain an advantage. And that means that you're going to start killing more civilians. Or you need to affect the other side's ability to keep its population and its army fed, maybe with a blockade. But that literally means like doing things that will make the other side's civilians go hungry. Also expanding the reach of total war. Consider for a moment how you would feel about a government that sent you off to fight in this war, that got you to sign up for this war with propaganda about how glorious and patriotic and necessary it is to fight for your country. And then you get to war and it's just awful. It's just people continually being told to rush at machine gun fire and then bodies being left in no man's land between the trenches because you can't go get them because you'll get shot. Let's look at some of the more iconic battles of World War I so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. In 1915, the Battle of Ypres saw probably the first use of chlorine gas in war. If you've never encountered poison gas or its effects, consider how disorienting and horrific it would be to see gas approaching your trench and then the effect it has on people. In this battle, Germans used chlorine gas, and then they bombed the town that was nearby. And chemical warfare on the scale was new and scary, and it inspired others to start using the same. Like I said, generals didn't adapt old tactics to new reality. Old tactics used to involve taking a bayonet on your rifle, rushing at the enemy, capturing land. And generals did not adapt this strategy to the age of the machine gun. And so you had truly horrific battles like the Battle of the Somme in 1916 that scarred a generation of British people, the ones who survived. This battle was so bad it became a metaphor for futile and indiscriminate slaughter. It involved getting nearly 60,000 British infantry troops to run at the opposing fire and through no man's land, which, was deadly. And it resulted in 60,000 casualties on the first day alone. And generals continued to order the men over the top, order them to rush towards the enemy in this battle regardless. As traumatic as the Somme was for the British, there was an equally traumatic battle for the French, and that was the Battle of Verdun, which came to be known as the meat grinder. It was in 1916, and it was a 303-day battle in which the Germans tried to bleed France white, to try to just kill as many people as possible. Of this battle, 2 French soldiers wrote, "You eat beside the dead, you drink beside the dead, you relieve yourself beside the dead, and you sleep beside the dead. People will read that the front line was hell. How can people begin to know what that one word, hell, means?" So notice the town that is bombed out. That was a town, that was a place where people lived. So again, you can see total war increasingly affecting civilians. There's less and less of a divide between the people who fight war and the people who are just living their lives in a country that is at war. It was the longest single battle of World War I. So, the thing about this war that was so unsettling then was the contrast between what people expected and were told and what people got. Most people expected the war to be brief and enlisted with dreams of heroism in mind. And partly this was because the war hadn't been fought in Europe itself in living memory. And nobody really had any experience of what these new weapons could do, especially if they're faced, on the receiving end. And nobody really knew exactly what they'd signed up for. And nationalism factored into that too. If you think your country is the best and the strongest, then you think your country's going to win really fast, and it's kind of a surprise when it doesn't. The war, as you've seen, was not brief, and combat was not heroic. There's nothing heroic about lying in a muddy trench and then running into machine gun fire for nothing. The war, therefore, did a ton of damage to the idea that fighting in a war could even ever be heroic. And this is going to become important because the generation that fought in World War I was the generation making decisions during World War II, during the run-up to World War II. And it explains the reluctance that otherwise seems so puzzling to get involved into another war and to use armed force to stop Nazi Germany from rebuilding its army, leading to World War II. So we have the trenches themselves too, which were also terrible because they were literally dug into the mud, and this is where soldiers stayed when they weren't being shot at. In the trenches, because they were wet and muddy, one of the hazards included trench foot. So like when your feet are wet and cold for so long and you can't ever dry them, they literally start rotting off while they're still on you. And this was a common thing. As a result of trench warfare, shell shock as a concept emerged. And here I'm going to read to you a little selection from historian Jay Winter on the end of heroism, so you can understand what it was about the trenches that was just so haunting for this generation, and why the concept of post-traumatic stress, which then was called shell shock, was developed as a result of this war. Jay Winter writes, many of the soldiers had to cope with images that wouldn't go away. Many parts of human bodies were actually used to shore up the trench system itself, so to like reinforce it. Some soldiers found it humorous to hang their water canteens on a protruding arm or a protruding leg. These were not people who were disrespectful of the dead. They were living with the dead. One can imagine the possibility of becoming numb to such images, but those who couldn't turn off their feelings internalized them, brought them home with them, dreamt about them, and went mad because of them. There was this problem of what to do with people who had been shot. You can't get out of the trench to bury them, can you? So as a result, people had to live with bodies of, and many times people they knew, their slain friends, in the trenches while trying not to die, is kind of what he's saying. It's horrible. Which is why Robert Graves, a soldier who was there, says patriotism in the trenches was too remote a sentiment and at once rejected as fit only for civilians or for prisoners. A new arrival to the trenches who talked patriotism would soon be told to cut it out. There was also a class aspect in that upper class officers weren't the people rushing at machine guns. They were the ones telling the lower class infantrymen to rush at machine guns. So a classist resentment kind of developed there too. And there's just this constant, inescapable death everywhere. Even after the war, things were very difficult for people who survived, and they experienced alienation when they returned home, meaning they didn't feel like they could relate to civilian life or civilian people really so much anymore. There was this weird sort of culture shock about returning to a place you come from and finding a society that just can't understand the war experience, has no idea why you're so traumatized by it. There's also going to be this long-term problem that now you've armed and trained a generation of men who are very used to violence and who are now alienated from society upon return home. And the anger and bitterness and familiarity with violence can very easily be leveraged by, leaders, I don't know, like Mussolini or like Hitler, like fascist leaders who have an ideology that's like aggressive and that channels that bitterness at specific targets. So like long term, this is going to be a problem too. Then even after the war, history's cosmic joke. The year the war ends, the Spanish flu hits and infects 500 million people, killing 50 to 100 million of them, which at the time was 3 to 5% of the world's population. Even after that, long-term effects of the war continued to haunt this generation, especially if you were on the losing end. If you were a German soldier and you happened to be communist or Jewish or ascribed to leftist politics, You were blamed for Germany losing the war, for stabbing Germany in the back, as the conspiracy theory went. Germany lost the war because they gave up, because they couldn't keep fighting, because they ran out of resources. But to save face, a lot of prominent generals promoted the conspiracy theory that they didn't give up, they didn't lose. They were betrayed from behind the lines by these weak elements of society, communists and Jews. And this is going to fuel the rise of Nazism, which is coming up next in history. One part of trench warfare that we haven't touched on yet was this concept of no man's land, which was a phrase used to describe the space between enemy trenches, where people were running towards machine gun fire, where you'd have bodies kind of littered all over the place. And it's going to be hard to really get the trench experience without kind of understanding the horror that it would involve to live in a trench and to see this space in front of you and then be told to run at it. So I'm a firm believer in showing people the reality of history, but I also understand that some people just don't need this kind of violence in their lives. So in the next slide, I'm going to show you a black and white picture of what no man's land looked like. If you don't want to see a relatively violent image, please do not look until I tell you that it's like safe again. Okay, so I'm going to click the slide. Don't look if you don't want to see it. If you do want to see it, this is what no man's land would have involved. Okay, it's safe again. Everybody can look. All right, so how do you get people to sign up for a war like this? In a total war, you need the whole nation, people at home as well as the soldiers, to be mobilized in support of the war effort. And that means either enlisting in the army, saving food, working in war industries, but also in their opinions, being pro-war. Especially for some of these states that were democratic. You can't have people at home against a war that you're trying to fight, especially if that war demands sacrifice and active involvement of people back home. In wars like this, you had civilians more and more affected by the war itself. In terms of bombing, war zones being increasingly in civilian towns. In terms of people you knew that were all fighting. And in terms of propaganda. Because war required active support from the population, governments increasingly needed to use propaganda to shape their opinions. And in some cases, this propaganda was like your very standard, be patriotic and go fight for your country. In some cases, it was more of the threatening type, like what you see on the right. Go fight for your country now, or it looks like German soldiers are going to come and shoot you, is the implication. In some cases, it was based on this national idea, pro patria. Remember that phrase from the Wilfred Owen poem, for your country, join the army. In some cases, it was, a menacing view of what's going to happen if we lose, like the map on the right that was developed to show people what, they believed that Germany's war aims included, which apparently included conquering all of South America, who knew? But also, increasingly, it meant propaganda that demonized the enemy. For most human beings, it takes an awful lot to allow them to kill another human being, says Anthony Protankis, a psychology professor at UC Santa Cruz. The only way to do it is to justify the killing, to make the enemy look as evil as possible. The secret in propaganda is that when you demonize, you dehumanize, says a professor of mass communications at California State University. When you dehumanize people, it allows you to kill your enemy and no longer feel guilty about it. That is why during World War II, a lot of caricatures became animals. You can kill a monkey a lot more easily than you can kill a neighbor. Okay, so like those historians are talking about a process called dehumanization. It means framing the enemy in terms of like being somehow evil, morally bad, less human, and therefore easier to want to hate. Fueling this during World War I, this is going to get really bad in World War II. In World War I, it begins. You had fake atrocities and propaganda films that began to be used, such as propaganda about German soldiers like killing nuns and babies in Belgium. That was really common, and not necessarily based on fact. That kind of thing can get populations to really support a war, right? Because that's horrible. Of course you want to stop an army that's just evil and killing nuns and babies. It's a lot easier to get people to support a war that way than just by saying, well, you know, there's this Archduke and he got shot in Serbia and Germany was friends with them, and so now we're fighting in France. So go fight for Britain in the trenches in France to gain nothing, right? The Germans are evil is just way easier. And so like that's kind of the way that they went. The Germans did this too. I'm just using the easiest possible example. The thing about this is that once you do that, once you demonize the enemy and pitch a war in terms of like good versus evil instead of strategic objectives, there's no easy way to stop. There's no easy way to stop doing that, and there's no easy way to stop the war if you need to. If you're fighting a war against an enemy who you've said is pure evil, it's hard to explain letting him win. So that kind of helps explain why the war went on for 4 years, even after it was abundantly clear that nobody was winning. After a while, states got themselves in a position where they couldn't exactly quit either. In terms of the big picture, this led to what is called disillusionment for an entire generation of people. Disillusionment describes a profound feeling of disappointment that comes from discovering that something is not as good as you believed it to be. It's like a huge contrast between expectations and reality, a big, big letdown. And in this case, it was mass disillusionment against governments and institutions and beliefs that got them into this war to begin with. This war that was fought for nothing, that gained nothing, that cost millions of lives in probably like the least heroic way ever, led people to seriously question the governments and the beliefs that got them there. And this is going to have huge implications for after the war, because after the war, do you go back to trusting the people who started the war to begin with? No. In a lot of cases, people were very easily swayed by leaders with new ideas, new simple ideas, maybe, to fix the problems that the war started, extremist ideas, perhaps. Nothing captures this gap between expectations and reality, in my opinion, this disillusionment, better than the war poets of World War I. I don't know about you, but when I think of poetry, I think of like pretty things and nicely phrased words. And in World War I, we have some of the most haunting poetry that I have ever read, because it was a literate generation that went to fight in the trenches, that wanted to capture the magnitude of the horror that they found there. And poetry was one way for them to do it. It was one way for them to sort of approximate the experience for an audience back home. And this was poetry with a goal. The goal was people need to understand how bad this was and not do it again. And so you get poems like Siegfried Sassoon's Survivors. Remember, he was at the Somme. He writes, "No doubt they'll soon get well. The shock and strain have caused their stammering, disconnected talk. Of course they're longing to go out again, these boys, with old scarred faces learning to walk. They'll soon forget their haunted nights, their cowed subjection to the ghosts of friends who died, their dreams that drip with murder, and they'll be proud of glorious war that shattered all their pride. Men who went out to battle grim and glad, children with eyes that hate you, broken and mad." These poems are dark. They're ironic. And they clearly capture that there's nothing good about this experience, and that this experience basically just shattered a generation of boys who went to fight that came back broken. Dulce et decorum est. I read you guys a snippet of that at the very beginning of this lesson. It's one of the most iconic poems of the war. And if you'd like, I encourage you to pause the slide here and just read it. It's the one on the right. And now we come to notes for the day. So please make sure to capture what World War I was like and the effects of disillusionment in your notes. First, the war part. When World War I began in 1914, most Europeans believed it would be over fast, and many soldiers enlisted believing they would be heroic and bring glory to their nations. The reality of the war was different. The introduction of new military technology like machine guns, barbed wire, trenches, poison gas made the modern battlefield extremely dangerous, and it became functionally impossible to advance quickly, leading to heavy casualties for soldiers. Trench warfare is the most iconic style of war for World War I. And it led to a long, drawn-out stalemate, basically tie, along the Western Front, which made World War I into a war of attrition. It was no longer a war that you could win by capturing ground. Instead, decisive victories in the battle were rare, and the only way to win was to wear out the enemy's capacity to keep fighting. Trenches were dug as defenses against the modern weapons of war, and this kind of warfare made it basically impossible to advance, like you'd get shot. This led to a stalemate. Millions died, battle lines didn't change much in 4 years, little progress was made, nothing was gained. And again, if this isn't a definition that you know already, a war of attrition is a war that you win by wearing down the enemy's capacity to sustain war, rather than by winning a decisive battle or taking the capital city of the opponent or anything like that. It's less visible. To win, one side needs to get more resources like money, weapons, soldiers than the other, or knock out the other side's ability to produce weapons and keep its population fed. Effects of this kind of war were disillusionment. World War I led to widespread disillusionment with pre-war institutions, authorities, and values. It did a lot of damage to the idea that war could be heroic, and that's going to explain this generation's reluctance to go to war again, and therefore the failure to stop the rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Loss of faith in pre-war institutions and values also resulted in a void that was later filled by totalitarian regimes. So Soviet communism on the left, fascists and Nazis on the right, all proposing new solutions to an audience with a good reason to doubt the old way of doing things. Often these new solutions were deadly. In addition, the Great Depression is coming up next, and that would further damage faith in existing political structures, which leads to political extremism. The stalemate and the effects of this war of attrition in the shorter term led to protests, riots, uprisings, and even revolution, so general political instability. And we see this early in Russia in 1917, where a successful revolution leads to the creation of the Soviet Union, the first communist state. But also other unsuccessful revolutions and uprisings in other states, like Germany notably, led to political instability and fear of communism spreading, which fed into fascist and Nazi ideology down the line. Next, exposure to violence led to brutalization, meaning like people becoming very comfortable and familiar with just daily violence. So brutalization of parts of European society. And that is going to feed extremist politics also. Exposure to this kind of violence brutalized European society, which had grown accustomed to the largely peaceful 19th century before, thinking that peace was the normal state of affairs. After the war, Europeans were increasingly willing to resort to other kinds of force, from political assassinations to street violence, and to seek radical solutions to their problems, even if those solutions were kind of violent. Finally, because propaganda in all warring nations depicted the enemy in terrible light, like as morally evil, and dehumanized the enemy, after the war, it became easier for people to draw the line between us and them, to continue to think about people who weren't from your state as morally suspect, which is going to cause problems down the line. So please pause this slide here and capture this in your notes.